Welcome to Cult Favorite, the podcast that never lies about its attendance numbers. What was the lie about attendance numbers?
WrestleMania 3, they claimed it was 93,000 people. It was like 78,000 people.
Still a lot of people.
Yeah, but it stood as like
the point. It's the principle.
It's the principle. Well, it became a thing more recently because 2 summers ago there was a show in London by WWE's competitor AEW that had 83,000 people, and that was the new record gate with the actual numbers. It's starting already.
The attention and concern that people give to the numbers in their audiences, I'm Merinda Simmons.
and I'm Mike Altman. And we are two intrepid religious studies professors trying to understand.
Intrepid and right? Isn't that the lane? I'm trying to work on my wrestling vocabulary.
Yeah. Are we baby faces? I think we're baby faces.
Yeah. Instead of heels.
Well, I guess one of us has to be the heel for this early.
I'm probably the heel. I'll take it.
I always cheered for the heels.
But I will not. There will be no body slamming.
I always cheered for the heels.
There will be brain slamming. What?
Brain slamming. Yeah, so we're talking about these cult documentaries that you can't stop binge watching. If you want to support the show, you can find us on social media at Cult Favorite Pod. We have a Facebook page there too you can find, and you could subscribe to the show. It's never too late to steal someone's phone and subscribe them to the show. To email people a link to the show if you think they would enjoy it.
You're supporting the kind of behavior that would show up in WrestleMania, and I don't support it.
I don't think stealing someone's phone, you're giving it back to them. You're giving them a gift.
That means borrowing.
Yeah.
Am I splitting hairs? Borrowing and stealing?
Yeah. But the point is, they open their phone one day to listen to whatever terrible podcast they're planning to listen to. Okay. And then here we are.
You're comparing again. There's space in the universe for all of the podcasts. There's time enough for all of us.
The universe is constantly expanding.
I'm glad that we're not worried about our audience numbers.
I never look at them, I promise. So
what are we talking about today, Michael?
So what had happened was I said, not as like a podcast thing, I was like, hey, you should check out this Mr. McMahon documentary.
Why did you think I should check it out? If you were not thinking about
because you were the one person I knew who might watch it.
Oh, interesting. Sure.
Like, my partner refused.
Yes.
And I was like, this is close enough.
Merinda's willing to roll.
Yeah, this is something that you might put on while you fold laundry. And so I was like, this is like, and so
we're talking about Mr. McMahon on Netflix.
Came out last fall.
And there's 6 episodes? 5.
Yeah, 6 episodes.
5.5 too many.
And so I was like, you should check it out. And then this was your idea. You were like, then like a couple episodes in or whatever.
I've watched it twice now.
Yeah, you were
this is how much I care about and respect your brain. And
then you're like, we should talk about it on the podcast. You could have watched 1 episode and been like, never mind, and moved on with your life, and we'd be talking about something else right now. But
that's fair. But there are things to talk about.
There's a lot. Yeah.
So we'll see where we go. So wait. What's our content warning? Because stuff shows up in this one.
Yeah, there are moments we'll be talking about both sexual abuse and child sex abuse. There's a couple scandals that we'll have to hit on at some point. So if you don't want to
scandals involving allegedly our future Secretary of Education.
She got asked about it during her Senate hearing.
And what'd she say?
What did she say? She was asked about the lawsuit.
None of my business. It didn't happen.
Yeah, that she didn't. That was we handled that, and the person was fired or something like that. She kind of brushed it off.
Sure, and then brought back.
Pat Patterson. We'll talk about Pat Patterson.
What did you, beyond everything, know?
I knew so much.
First,
so here's I knew almost everything that was in this documentary already.
That's good, because I knew virtually nothing.
Yes. I didn't know as much about the so-called ring boy abuse scandal, but nothing else was really new to me. And I had kind of knew about that already, but I didn't know all the details. So I'll say this, though. I grew up a wrestling fan, but I was never a WWF/WWE fan.
Were you allowed to watch it at home? Was it
I was allowed.
Because it sounds like you had some parental editorial control.
It was not disallowed.
Content.
It was not disallowed.
Okay.
But it was not encouraged.
Interesting.
But also, I didn't.
Springer was not something you were allowed to watch.
Springer was what. No,
interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
But I will say I did not watch a lot of WWF, especially during the Attitude Era. If I did, it was like a buddy got the pay-per-view, let's all go over watch it. On Monday night, I was watching WCW, which was I
feel like my job, by the way, this time around is to like call you on the things that if somebody has not watched this, maybe they don't know the language.
Okay.
What's
WCW was the Southern-based, Atlanta-based, Ted Turner-owned competition.
What did it stand for?
World Championship Wrestling.
There it is.
And it was the spiritual successor to the old NWA, the National Wrestling Alliance. And so if you're thinking WCW, that was like Ric Flair and Dusty Rhodes as opposed to Hulk Hogan and Randy Savage. And I started watching it in like 93, 94 around there. That's a whole other story. And then, but yeah, I followed WCW all the way until it became a terrible product and went out of business, and McMahon bought them and bought all their intellectual property and bought the tape library. And then I stopped watching pretty much a few months after that and stopped watching wrestling altogether. Went to college, did lots of other things, and then didn't come back to wrestling till about 2015, 2016. Okay. When I got stuck at home after a surgery and found some wrestling on Netflix, and then found a bunch of other stuff. But I was, so I was never a WWF, never watched, like, so a lot of the stuff in this documentary I knew from being around wrestling and following wrestling news and reading wrestling newsletters, but I wasn't actively watching it. It wasn't my, I was way more into just a very different kind of wrestling product that was, and it got into stuff in like Mexico and Japan and other stuff.
I'm interested to hear what appeals to you about it, but we can get there in a minute.
Yeah.
You want to know what I knew?
What did you know? I see.
I knew that Hulk Hogan was in Rocky 3.
Yeah.
I knew most of all that Andre the Giant was in Princess Bride. I can quote that movie to you.
Yeah.
It's
a great movie.
It is a great movie. And I knew that Dwayne The Rock Johnson has a really good singing voice.
Yeah.
Because of Moana.
Yeah. Well, he did. Yeah.
You're Welcome's a good song.
One of the one of the highest rated Monday Night Raw segments of all time was The Rock singing. Was a Rock singing a song segment.
Oh, really?
Like in the 90s, yeah. Huh. He was tag teamed with with Mankind, and it was the whole thing.
I only learned it, recently, but I was impressed. I mean, this is back to, as I have said before, I am, for better or worse, like aware of my own positioning in relation to media demographics.
Right.
And WWF was just never made for me. It was never made for me.
WWF was, yeah.
And I feel like, when I know that I'm not invited to a party, my own pride or introversion or I don't know what is something that keeps me from looking for like access points to that party.
Yeah. So
I'm not above crashing a party. Like I've done that, but
I have a theory. so I think one of the things that I really don't like about the WWF is that they have positioned themselves, or WWE is. Can we quickly
like say, so WWF, this is something I learned from the documentary. WWF is not is called WWE because WWF stands in fact for
the World Wildlife Fund.
Right.
And they lost the right to use that acronym, and they had to go back into all of their tape library and blur out the F and all this stuff.
I mean, in the documentary, people are calling it WWF, but then in the little like captions, I don't know if you watch with captions on. I do. Yes. I always watch with the captions always say WWE.
Yeah,
anyway,
it's the whole thing.
So you were about to say, sorry.
But I was gonna say, the way they posit themselves as being like the totality of professional wrestling, even though for years they wouldn't even use the phrase professional wrestling, it was sports entertainment, and that people, and because of that, most normal people who aren't into this stuff don't recognize the like massive world of diverse professional wrestling that has existed in forever, before and after the WWF, WWE. And because I have a theory that there's a wrestling match for everyone.
Okay.
Like, I think as a performance art, that there are at the very least a match, if not a wrestler or a promotion for everyone.
Because so I just haven't found the right match.
I don't think you have. I don't think you have. This is my theory. I had an idea for a whole podcast where I get random people I know and I try to pitch them a match, and then like we talk about what they're into media wise. Then I pitch them a match, and then we talk about it afterwards. Mm-hmm. But that's a whole other thing. So, anyways, yeah, I'm serious. Like, there's all sorts of professional wrestling.
So tell us about this.
I love that we have a video today so people can see the skeptical look on your face just then. Of like, no
Maybe
way.
They can't zoom though. Please don't zoom.
Just isolate.
I have big glasses. They'll hide like what my eyebrows and my like forehead are doing.
All right. This was a giant. So, okay, what gets covered in this documentary?
Yes,
this is my job to try to
take us through.
So if there's something that I skip, stop me. That because this is what I thought I should hit.
I don't think you're going to skip stuff. What I think is going to happen is that you're going to go through this, and then later on, you're going to have some editorial work to do. So I'm just going to let you run with it,
all right,
buddy.
So what gets covered in this documentary is the entire history of the WWE and Vince McMahon's role in the company, from going national in 1983 to his ouster from the company after the Janelle Grant sexual assault allegations and lawsuit in 2024.
And he came into the company because his dad had run it.
Yeah, his dad ran the old WWWF, which was the Northeastern territory, like New York, Connecticut, Eastern Pennsylvania. And
they had like territories, like regions.
Yeah.
It wasn't a...
It was like college football. They had like different sort of regional groups.
Okay.
And you would have, there was a lawsuit against, these were all these territories were part of the National Wrestling Alliance. And if you tried to run a wrestling promotion in a town and you weren't an NWA member, you weren't the one the NWA had chosen, they would do things to put you out of business. Those are so-called outlaw promotions. And so you'd have these wrestling wars where there's two companies in St. Louis and they're battling until one of them, to attract fans and get on TV until one of them goes out of business. So like the history of wrestling is this history of business competition and trying to put the competition out of business from the 1930s forward. And there's actually a lawsuit about the monopoly, et cetera, et cetera. But anyways, so, okay, what's not in the documentary is a bunch of stuff. There's like a ton of unreliable narrators in this documentary because I think the average person, the documentary was made by Chris Smith, and it was executive produced by Bill Simmons. Do you know who Bill Simmons is? He's a sports...
I know I'm not related.
He's a...
I do have an Uncle Bill, a late Uncle Bill. Okay. I did have a Bill Simmons.
No, this is a different Bill. Yeah, okay. Is he from Boston? This is a Bill Simmons who, have you heard of The Ringer, the website? Culture?
Oh, sure.
Yeah, so Bill Simmons is the guy who made The Ringer.
Okay.
It's not a wrestler. And so he works at he's always existed at the kind of like edge of sports and culture.
Okay.
So he's a wrestling guy. He's one of the executive producers of this. And then Bill Shoemaker, not Bill Shoemaker, Dave Shoemaker, who's in the documentary, who's written some wrestling books, was another one of the executive producers. There's a podcast they did about it right when it came out, and they kind of talk about how for them it's for actually this documentary is for you. It's for non-wrestling fans. It's for non-wrestling fans who might watch a documentary on Netflix about something interesting. So maybe not you. Although
we'll get there.
You did say you did watch it twice.
I did.
So
that's because I want to be thorough in my research and preparation.
But I think to the average non-wrestling fan, they don't recognize which of the people in the documentary are full of shit most of the time and are kind of like known as being unreliable narrators and who's not. So that's kind of missing from it. The documentary was almost done multiple times, but all the stuff that happens in the last half of the last episode was happening as they were finishing it. And so there's a real gap in production between episode 4 and episodes 5 and 6, and especially episode 6. They were literally, it started out as a documentary that Vince McMahon was on board with, and he was like, kind of, I want you to be as honest as you can and all of this. And then things got real and the lawsuit came and everything. And then he stopped cooperating after that. So also the WWE without McMahon has actually been a much better product and had been doing much bigger business than it was before he left. And so there was always a feeling, and you kind of get this from the documentary, that like there could never be a WWE without McMahon.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, after he left, the shows got better, the ratings went up, the attendance gates have gotten higher. So it's actually been the consensus amongst most wrestling people is that like McMahon leaving was really good for business.
Interesting. Okay.
And that's another theme is what's good for business. Mm-hmm. Okay. 6 episodes, the whole 40-year history of WWE. Here we go. Episode 1 is the story of Vince McMahon taking the WWF from a regional territory in the Northeast to the first national wrestling company. To go national, Vince needed the right superstar, and that was Hulk Hogan. The goal was to make WWF mainstream entertainment that drew on all sorts of aspects of entertainment. So we get the Cyndi Lauper and the so-called Rock and Wrestling Connection and the MTV shows. Yeah, right. Wendy Richter and Cyndi Lauper. We get the episode culminates with the first WrestleMania in 1985, and which was a success in many ways. But then it teases that McMahon is becoming a target. Episode 2, we get all of the 1980s and early 1990s scandals and controversies around the WWF. Hogan is the top guy, and they're selling all this merchandise to kids. WrestleMania 2 was not great, but WrestleMania 3 with Hogan and Andre.
Yes, because Hogan was kind of the successor. Like Andre the Giant was the big star. Yeah. And then Hulk Hogan became like the one that like they put a lot of resources around.
Yeah.
And there was a lot of emphasis on like who was their star at various moments.
Yeah. And you don't get WrestleMania, and the national push doesn't work without either Hogan or McMahon. Like you need McMahon's vision, and then you need Hogan as a star.
The character.
And if you don't have either of those, it would never work. And I think for a long time, it was just people would say that it was all McMahon. And I think Hogan has been was always trying to say, like, and he says this time, like, no, it was me. Like, I was huge for this. So, for better or worse. Noted racist Hulk Hogan. But journalist Phil Mushnick, who's all over this documentary, is beginning to unearth the dark and abusive side of wrestling. We have Tony Atlas, a former wrestler, talking about how we just abused women. Like, he just says that.
Yeah.
You have steroid abuse. You have one of the most disturbing cases is Mel Phillips, who was a ring announcer and sort of did all sorts of things for the company. His abuse of so-called ring boys, so these teenage boys that he would recruit to come help set up the ring, and they'd get to hang out around, the dressing room and meet wrestlers, and then he would, proposition them as a whole. Really, a lot of that stuff there. There's actually currently a lawsuit in Maryland because of a change in the law and the statute of limitations about this. And then we get to the steroid trial in 94, where that really puts, at that point in 1994, ratings are down. Hogan said he wants to retire, but he's actually shifted to the competition, WCW, we talked about earlier.
Betrayal.
And the betrayal.
So harsh.
Yeah. I mean... Yeah, nothing in writing, and actually,
it was I thought it was weird that this like mega businessman Vince McMahon was like doing a lot of his business with like gentlemen's agreements and handshakes and stuff.
And like the Hogan thing changed that because you started to get non-competes from then on, and so even now, like they'll release wrestlers, but they have like a 30 or 90-day non-compete. The other big one was when Lex Luger left and showed up on the first episode of WCW's Monday Night Show, and no one at WWF happened to remember that he was leaving or something, and so they put him on a show, and then like the next Monday night he shows up.
Yeah.
At the Mall of America.
There were a lot of antics between WWE and WCW. It sounds like
they were
their own like characters in a production corporate ring behind the scenes.
Yeah, and that was what they don't talk about in the documentary is that is the same moment that the internet is happening. And so for me as like a young, whatever, in like 95, 96, I'm like getting on the internet for the first time, like on AOL, like reading all these news sites and discovering like, oh, I can look up, like, because Raw was taped. I can look at, here's the results from Raw, and then I'm going to go watch Monday Nitro. Or I remember reading about like the Razor Ramon and Diesel are coming to WCW. Right. So anyways.
I like that WCW at one point was like giving away the results of what was happening.
That worked. That worked really well until
for
it
a
didn't.
Minute. Yeah,
and then they gave away one and everyone switched the channel over to watch.
Ruh-roh.
But that was there already.
All right.
And then Yes. Then we get the Monday Night Wars. Episode 3 is about this the so-called Monday Night Wars, and sets the context. The episode title is Screwjob. So we get the Wendy Richter story about...
Wendy Richter was
the WWF champion, women's champion, and so they say in the documentary that she wouldn't lose, but actually what happened was her contract was expiring. Mm-hmm. She wouldn't sign a new one because she wanted more money. Mm-hmm. And instead of extending her contract, they got the fabulous Moolah to put on a mask and be this masked wrestler who pinned her, and didn't tell that was what was going to happen. And the ref counted fast, and it looked horrible. It looked horrible.
Bad.
But this is like foreshadowing where we're headed with the Bret Hart story.
May I say, I keep interrupting because I found so many people so interesting. And Bret Hart, I think, was chief among them.
My favorite WWF wrestler. The only WWF wrestler I really loved. Yeah, because he came to WCW after the screw job. And I
well, what did you love about him?
I
bet it was different. I'm not sure what I found compelling about him, but I like at the very beginning, he says at one point, like, I was a real artist. And he feels emotional about it.
He approached wrestling as both as an athletic sport and a performance at the same time. And so he was known as being this incredibly, when we talk about like a technical wrestler, that is a guy who knows how to make it look like a real fight and knows how to make it look like a real wrestling match.
Okay.
He was the best at that. He was very good at that. Okay. And so he was always, and that was always what I liked about wrestling. Yeah. Like I wanted to see the match and what the athletic is happening in the match is telling the story. I don't want to see a bunch of storylines backstage that then lead to a crappy whatever. I want and he had him and Shawn Michaels had a 60-minute match at WrestleMania that was amazing before all this. So he was one of my favorites. Right. I actually saw him wrestle after his brother died. We'll get to that in a second. I was at the Monday Nitro after that in Chapel Hill and saw him wrestle Chris Benoit, another Canadian wrestler, as like a tribute match to his brother, which then foreshadows what happens to Chris Benoit later.
But Bret Hart is the object of the Montreal screw job,
which they also screwed that story up too. So, anyways, Sarah trial ends. Vince doesn't get convicted. Hogan goes to WCW. They start to beat WWF in the ratings, especially once he turns heel. Side note: I was a big WCW fan. My favorite, the Hogan heel turn at Bash of the Beach 1996 is one of those I can remember where I was. I was in Ali Karkuki's den watching it live, and I shrieked, and it was one of the greatest experiences of wrestling in my life. Then we get a very one-sided version of the Prince and Bret Hart and the screw job at Survivor Series in 97.
Okay.
They don't ever say this. Bret Hart had creative control in his contract. So he got to decide when and how he lost.
Oh, interesting. No wonder he was pissed.
So, yes. They never came to Bret the day of the show and said, you're losing.
Do you know, I was going to ask you because I thought maybe I just was missing something perhaps for obvious reasons with my own relationship or lack to these narratives. But I couldn't really figure. I was going to ask you what was the actual drama behind.
So there's also an entire documentary about this event.
Ooh, what's it called?
Called Bret Hart Hitman Hart Wrestling with Shadows. It's on YouTube now for free.
Okay.
I've used it in class. But they were following Bret Hart for just a documentary about him while all this was happening.
Oh, interesting.
So when he goes in and talks to Vince, he's wearing a wire that Vince doesn't realize for the documentary.
So he had creative control. He gets to decide when he loses.
Yes.
But Vince had decided...
And they had already had a conversation that he was going to lose to... So Bret Hart did not trust Shawn Michaels for a variety of reasons, obviously. He was really close friends with Ken Shamrock, former UFC fighter turned WWF wrestler.
Shawn Michaels is the other wrestler he's about to get in the ring with.
And he was really good, and he respected The Undertaker. So at the next pay-per-view, they were going to do a four-way elimination match where Hart would lose to either Shamrock, who he was buddies with, or Undertaker, who he was trusted, and then Michaels would win in the end. This was all laid out.
Okay.
And it wasn't the last day of his contract. Like, he still had another month left on this deal.
Yeah.
And so this just was Vince wanting to just seize control from Hart because he had creative control. So yeah, that's all not in the documentary.
Okay. I'm still a little confused, but it's fine. We should move on. Okay. Keep going.
So then they say that the screw job gives birth, and the audience's reaction was very anti-Vince, very pro Bret Hart. This is also when the internet's happening. so people are reading all about this. All this news is dripping out to the newsletters. And then this is supposedly the birth of the Mr. McMahon character. Side note, somebody who's not in the documentary, the head writer for WWF at the time, Vince Russo, actually was the one who had to convince Vince to turn heel. Because Vince thought he was a good guy. He's like, no, they're gonna be on my side. They're gonna know that I'm doing what's right here. And Vince Russo's like, they hate you. You should go heel. Episode 4 is the Attitude Era episode. So to beat WCW, WWF takes on more attitude, which basically means more straight dude sex appeal, objectification, and exploitation of women.
Hard to imagine more
violence
than there was, but
storylines to push the envelope. As noted, blackface wearer and current head of WWE creative Triple H, Paul Levesque, puts it, who is worse, the guy who did it or the people who loved it?
This is the question from Springer.
It's the Springer question.
And
yes.
I think that this is part of why, it's not the only reason, but I think it's part of why the two of these docuseries together make for an interesting conversational pairing.
And we don't get Vince Russo in this documentary, probably because he's kind of an asshole.
I was going to ask you if there were writers.
Yeah,
if they were like formal
Russo was
paid
one
writers.
of, so the creative team, like around, at least at the screw job and after, was Russo, Jim Cornette, who's not in this documentary either, and then McMahon. Those are the main three creative team people. And then the Bruce Mitchell, who's like just Vince McMahon's toady, was kind of involved, but not really. And it was actually Cornette who had and Russo kind of together came up with the idea of the screw job, but they didn't think Vince was going to do it. But Russo is the one who has the crash TV theory about if I have to make sure that if something good something interesting is happening every 5 minutes, or people will change the channel to the other guys. That was also behind kind of Richard Dominick's approach to Springer. So
right.
like you could kind of do a 1-to-1 and what like Russo.
It needs to be interesting with the sound off.
Yes.
That thing.
So Russo is the one who is behind a lot of the stuff in the Attitude Era, but Vince is sort of the editing it as it comes to him, right? So a lot of bad ideas that Russo comes up with don't get through. And a lot of things that Vince wants to do happen. So there's a lot there that they don't talk about.
Yeah.
We also get the story of Owen Hart's death because WWE didn't hire professional stunt designers. This is Bret Hart's brother.
Okay.
And Hart's death ends the episode as a kind of greatest example of the extremes of the Attitude Era. They don't talk about the like sheer negligence.
He dies because he's coming in from the rafters, like he's being dropped.
He's being dropped from the rafters, which was actually a thing
that he did.
That he had done before, but it was also a thing that WCW's like biggest star, the guy who was the good guy to Hulk Hogan's bad guy at this time, Sting, did this every week.
Okay.
But WCW had a special stunt team, and they had a backup rig set up. Like it had a much more complicated and secure system.
Okay. That
they did not use on Owen Hart because WWE was for a variety of reasons, mostly around Vince being a negligent jerk. That led to the death. So it wasn't the full story. Then episode 5, we shift. There's a gap here, I think, between 4 and 5. So 5 turns to like the McMahon family, which is a whole thing, and the blurring of lines between reality and fantasy in the WWE product. There's Mr. McMahon and Vince McMahon. There's the marriage between Paul Levesque, Triple H, and Stephanie McMahon. That is both on screen and in real life.
Triple H is a wrestler.
He's a wrestler, but he is now the chief creative officer for WWF.
I want to, I want to be mindful of the people like me who are don't change the.
And
Paul Levesque, stay with us, everybody.
Paul Levesque and Triple H are the same person.
Yes.
And it's Triple H, not just 3 H's. Anyways, and there's the father-son rivalry on screen between Shane McMahon, Vince McMahon's son. And Mr. McMahon and Shane did multiple matches in wrestling.
I feel like so much of this is really all about fathers and sons, but we'll get there.
But so many of the cult documentaries you watch are about families, right? And who's in a family and who doesn't have a family.
Sniffing into my microphone
There are Vince's real life affairs and his on-screen affair with Trish Stratus. There's the Sable lawsuit, and then Sable's return. Sable is a women wrestler. Yeah.
She's a wrestler and a beauty queen, and
bra and panties matches.
Her character is someone. Is she the one? No. Wait.
Trish Stratus is the one who is his.
I got them confused.
Mistress.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. There was a narrative. There was a storyline where Mr. McMahon and he starts having an affair with Trish. Right. while his wife Linda is like catatonic in a wheelchair.
Yeah, it was,
and
and they kind of pull stuff out of order. It's like the Sable stuff was much earlier than the later Trish stuff, but whatever.
Sable was just someone that he humiliated, and
Sable came in as Mark Mero's wife, and then anyways.
Okay.
On the business side, WWF goes public and puts WCW out of business. Sad face. But their newfound monopoly of national wrestling leads to a terrible product. They lose the WWF acronym, like we just talked about, to the World Wildlife Fund. You can find T-shirts with a panda bear with a chair.
Was the World Wildlife Fund, like, how... had that been a protracted back and forth? I wonder what the history is.
I don't know that much about it, other than I remember when it happened, because they had a whole "get the F out" was like their big slogan.
Sure.
Yeah, they
anyway.
And then the XFL Football League fails miserably.
This was one of Vince's ideas that how could it fail? I'm gonna just create a football league.
And Vince is constantly trying new things that fail miserably. Like they had a Times Square restaurant at one point that failed. They had a casino that failed. They had a bodybuilding competition that McMahon went around saying there's no steroids in this bodybuilding and they were all on steroids.
I roll. If you've got that much money, then you can literally afford to have a bunch of bad ideas.
Yes, he's had a ton of bad ideas. That's the majority of them. But the XFL failed. Actually, The Rock now owns the IP for the XFL. He bought it at an auction.
Some memento. This is a souvenir.
The episode 6 it starts off as almost the story of reforms in WWE and then the downfall of Vince. It starts with the Chris Benoit murder-suicide, which, oh man, I remember when that happened.
Who is Chris Benoit?
So Chris Benoit was a Canadian wrestler who was legitimately one of the best wrestlers in the world. And it's always a debate now because he did this monstrous thing, but also he was also one of the best wrestlers ever. And he wrestled a very, very high impact style. Took a ton of stuff to the head and very clearly had CTE. And he lived in Marietta, Georgia at the time, and he murdered his wife and son and then committed suicide.
Jesus.
And there's a whole thing in the documentary about how no one knew what had happened. And rather than wait to find out, they did a memorial for him that the first Monday night, which is the next day or very close.
Yeah, bad luck.
And then it comes out and there's actually, if you look at that Monday Night Raw memorial, there are a couple moments where there's a couple people who were very close to Benoit who seem very uncomfortable having to talk about it because I think we're starting to know what was going on.
Bad luck, not unlike continuing with the live wrestling show after Owen Hart dies.
No, they cut to the back. I didn't even realize this because I didn't watch that. I was not watching WWF. I didn't watch that pay-per-view. But they cut to an interview with a guy, Jeff Jarrett, another wrestler, who was Owen Hart's best friend right after that. And it's just insane that's... And McMahon says, if it was me there to keep the show going.
That was a good impression.
I've
You've been working on it? You've been honing it?
So every evil character in any story I've had to read to a child has always had Vince McMahon voice.
I see. Interesting.
Yeah. Sorry, pal.
You should do your takeaway in that voice.
Do it. And there are certain Vince McMahon isms that you... God damn it, pal. So...
All right. I'm weeping. Go.
Where was I?
We've gotten off track.
But then after Benoit... and they skip a lot of this. A bunch of wrestlers die. Benoit, Eddie Guerrero, Davey Boy Smith, et cetera, et cetera. All of these people dying in their 30s and 40s.
Also with dubious contacts?
I mean, they do have a little bit on this, but it's found in their hotel room.
Okay.
It is the, and actually McMahon talks about this. It's the mix of steroids and painkillers.
Yeah. Okay.
It just blows people's hearts up.
Yeah. Yeah.
Guerrero died before Benoit. I'm sorry, Guerrero died after Benoit, and they were best friends, and you can kind of track the two as a kind of extended story. So then they shift to a kid-friendly sort of PG moment coming out of the Benoit situation, and really because it's really advertiser-driven. So along with this, and they don't explain where these women come from, which I think is interesting. Women become actual wrestlers. So in 1997, 98, 99, you have like women who were basically fitness models or other kinds of models who are doing like bra and panties matches. And there's really no, by the 2010s, and they actually do a whole all women's pay-per-view called Revolution or Women's Evolution. You have women who are actually wrestling at the same kind of level in terms of like athleticism and story and match quality as men.
Okay.
And they don't say where any of these women are coming from, but they're coming from like a growing...
Doesn't matter, Mike.
Well, no, but the point is like, this was forced...
I think it matters.
It was forced upon them. Like
Yeah.
they didn't, like, there were other companies. You had, like, Japan has a long history of, like, the best wrestling in the world in 1992 was women in Japan. So Japan has a long history of this. You had other smaller independent companies where these women were getting experience. And really the big change was Ronda Rousey, who was able to sell massive pay-per-views as a UFC fighter.
Okay.
And the kind of the way that women were draws financially for UFC, and then Rousey comes to WWE because it's way easier on your body than fighting, and was in that Evolution pay-per-view, was in the first ever WrestleMania main event that was women's main event at WrestleMania. So it's actually all these outside forces,
right?
And that are pressuring. They say like the fans asked for it, but it was really like in order to compete with all these other companies, they had to change. So then we get that sort of heads to the shift of what's going on in the 2020s and the sort of downfall of Vince McMahon. So there's in the business is doing well in the especially coming out of the pandemic. And then in 2022, the board gets an email about a set of NDAs and payoffs that Vince used to cover up sexual affairs and sexual misconduct. That would go on to become Janelle Grant. We would find out later.
Who is Janelle Grant?
So Janelle Grant is a woman that lived in Vince. They don't even tell you who Janelle Grant is.
No, they don't. Because we do hear about someone who had been the first referee.
Yes.
Who then alleged like sex assault and coercive practices that then
Rita Chatterton.
Yes, and McMahon's, was it Rita Chatterton?
Oh, he has that horrible line.
Yeah, of like you know, it was consensual, but even if it was rape, the statute of limitations was up. So I mean, don't come at me with that.
Yes. And he had I think it was in 2022.
Piece of work.
They had a law in, I think it was New York, that you could, that got rid of the statute of limitations around sexual assault. So she sued in like 2021 or 22.
Yeah.
And got a settlement for that. But yeah, So Vince,
Janelle Grant though.
So Janelle Grant lived in the same apartment building as McMahon with her then ex-boyfriend, who she was just staying with, and her parents were very ill. She was taking care of them. McMahon meets her in the building.
Sure.
Offers her a job.
Sure.
And she ends up working, I think this was in 2020, and she ends up working there for 2 years in like the PR department in some way, but the job was all there as a part of a relationship that they were in that he claims was consensual. That if I do not suggest anyone go look at the lawsuit. It is incredibly gross, but it is incredibly dark and just like, wow. Like
telling, reflective.
Yes. Just
reflective of a certain climate that was.
And a lot of it in the lawsuit
much
contains text messages from McMahon to her that are incredibly gross. And then I was going to get this eventually, but so Grant, the lawsuit was filed in 2023, and then at the end of 2020, into 2024, the Justice Department was investigating McMahon and said, "Let's pause this lawsuit while we do our investigation, please." And the court said, "Okay." And then they ended up not, basically because Trump was elected, the Justice Department dropped their investigation because Trump and McMahon are buddies. And then in 2020, and then just this year, like 2-3 weeks ago, having now that the Justice Department thing's over, Janelle Grant's lawyers filed an amended complaint that has even more gross details and even more stuff about it, and that actually they didn't name Brock Lesnar in the first report. It was like a former UFC champion, which is only one wrestler who's ever been UFC champion, and then but he's named, and Stephanie's name is actually taken out of the lawsuit, which is interesting. So that's sort of the big story. But so the email that they get about this to the board and the NDAs is about Janelle Grant. We don't know that yet. Then it's revealed that there were 4 women that he paid $12 million to.
Right.
This leads to a whole bunch of other problems because he didn't tell there was WWE money that he spent on this, but he didn't tell the investors or he didn't tell the board or any of the shareholders. Then, so in January 2022, Vince steps down. He sort of, and then in 2023, he comes back, basically, he tries to come back. They don't even go into this details. He tries to come back. The entire board of directors, which includes Stephanie McMahon and
his daughter,
Triple H,
her husband,
say no unanimously. He then uses his shares, because he owns the majority of shares, to replace the board members who said no.
Sure.
So he can come back, and then Stephanie resigns. There is some speculation that Stephanie was the one who initially started this whole process. Like the email to the board had the only people who would have known about the NDAs were board members. So there's been some speculation. So she actually leaves and has never come back to the company. Vince comes back just to organize the sale of WWE. So they sell WWE to a company called Endeavor, who also owned UFC at the time. And they merged the two companies under a new corporation called TKO, which is UFC on one side and WWE on the other, with McMahon was supposed to be in charge of WWE and Dana White in charge of UFC. If you know who Dana White is, he's the guy who's run UFC for years. They then signed a $5 billion 10-year deal with Netflix for Monday Night Raw.
I see.
Then, like a week after that, right before the Royal Rumble, one of their biggest events of the year, the Janelle Grant lawsuit comes out.
Okay.
Vince no longer has majority ownership of the company. He's he just works there now, basically, and is in charge of creative. And so there's no one to keep him, and TKO he's gone. Like a tweet, I resign. I'm retiring, and he's never been. They take him out of the video game. They take him out of all the
70
intros.
70.
Really? Yeah, like 77.
I know Linda McMahon is 76.
I think he's like 75 or 76. Yeah. So and that's why the company's product was so terrible before he left, because he's a 73-year-old man trying to write television in the same way he did it with Hulk Hogan in 1983, and it just didn't work anymore. So what else? So yeah, the lawsuit's terrible, forced out, and with Vince,
and now they're doing better.
They're doing great creatively. It's still not my cup of tea, but creatively, financially. And then we get a bunch of questions at the end of the documentary about, like, who is the real Vince? And everyone says it's kind of the same guy, and he says it's not.
Right. This comes up throughout, where, like, how close is Vince McMahon to the character Mr. McMahon? Yeah,
that's kind of the organizing question.
And someone is like, well, it is him, but amplified. And somebody else is like, nah, it's not really him at all. And then somebody else is like, there's very little distinction between those two.
The only person who says there's no distinction is McMahon.
Yeah, except that he says that, though, it's like amplified, right? That it's him with the volume turned up. It's sort of like I felt about that the way that we received, like, descriptions of the Springer Show from people, where, like, it's an abomination, it's garbage, it's brilliant, it's the modern Coliseum.
Yeah.
It's like all of these things all wrapped up into one phenomenon but the kind of production question is really like, let's get to the bottom of this. Which one is it? Which is really kind of like the Garden documentary that we watched of like, is it a cult or is it a commune? Is it really a cult? Is this guy really this character? And I just find those questions fundamentally uninteresting.
Well, what do you want to talk about then? Segway.
I mean,
Segway City.
Segway City. I think that so much about WWFE, as I understand it, is very much about storylines and the performance of various scripts and narratives, and that is what is compelling to a lot of people because we get invested in the character, and so it's as much about, so it's not really about like the fight itself so much as like the clash of these personalities,
these
right?
Big stereotypes. Yeah.
So I find I think that there is something to talk about regarding just like storylines of masculinity and the performances thereof.
Yeah.
What kind of performances are allowed or disallowed. Yeah. I think that, broken men with dad issues are in charge of a lot of stuff. And this means that like we're on the receiving end of a lot of like personal negotiations of like and attempts at like acquiring power and money. And I think that those projections that they have because of where they come from or the issues that they're dealing with, like we're on the receiving end of those projections. And that's, I think, because we don't allow performances of masculinity to have much, if anything, to do with vulnerability.
Yeah,
none of those storylines can,
okay. I'm going to send you a very short essay about the storyline of one Hangman Adam Page, the anxious millennial cowboy.
Okay.
That the argument is this is a compelling, it's not a WWE storyline.
Oh, okay.
This is a compelling wrestling storyline because it is about someone who talks about their vulnerability and their depression. And so there's a whole nother, this is my thing, there's wrestling for everybody.
Where it's going.
Yeah. But you're 100% right. And especially in this period when, other than right now, in terms of business, the 97 to 2001 was the biggest business for WWF. And the question of who controls the company. Yeah. Between like the whole Austin McMahon feud was all about who has control of the company. Steve Austin. Who we didn't even talk about.
Stone Cold Steve
Austin, the greatest wrestler of that era, the biggest draw. Yes. I feel like people should know who Stone Cold Steve Austin is.
Dude, I don't. I mean, I know that the sound of that phrase put together rings a bell.
I know what each of those words are
in my head. Yeah, I've heard those words put together in a.
But that was about who controls the company. Yeah, that's not a storyline that people are doing, and that was what the WCW storyline with the NWO was: who controls the company. That got overdone and became boring and poorly done by lots of other companies and lots of subsequent storylines. Right. But it was, like you said, about power and money. Yeah. And like, that's the root, and so,
Because we hear from and about Vince McMahon's childhood. He had a pretty rough one. Yeah. He was on the receiving end himself of a lot of abuse. Yeah. And he didn't know who his father was until he was like 12. Literally the only times, and it happens early on, it happens like twice, that we see Vince McMahon having like some kind of emotional reaction, he kind of tears up, is when he talks about his father. And it is so messed up, dude. It's like, he never told me that he loved me, but I got it one time before he died, and that one time meant everything to me. And it's like, oh my God, you're telling this story as like a nice thing. That's the saddest thing I've ever, like, I'm sorry.
And Shane McMahon comes out across as like the most normal person.
This is his son.
His son. Yeah. As like, other than the fact that he threw himself off incredibly high things multiple times on television, probably to impress his father. Other than that, he seems to be the only normal person because Stephanie seems like, I don't know what's going on. Like there is a thing about, I think if we're thinking about this as like a cult documentary, there is so much space where I at least like want to fill in the sort of psychoanalytically fill in the blanks for these people that is very much the same kind of like watching the people behind the glass you
Sure.
get in these other cult documentaries.
Sure.
Like and it really has nothing for me to do with the on-screen storylines, because that's a whole, like, I'm not interested in what's real and what's fake about that. I'm sort of fascinated with like Stephanie McMahon being in the company, leaving the company. Shane left the company at one point. Like all of those sorts of stories that we'll never know. I don't think we'll ever know. But
so it's like
Well, and your point about masculinity is Sharon Mazer.
I like her.
Okay.
Sharon Mazer, yes, go.
Well, her book, go ahead.
Is called, I wrote this down, Professional Wrestling, Sport and Spectacle.
Yeah.
And we do hear from her. She's sort of like the scholar figure of the documentary. And she made a lot of good points. Specifically, like what kinds of things are made possible and allowable by virtue of the spectacle itself.
Yeah.
Such that like Mr. McMahon is someone that we can find abysmal and just this like total train wreck of a human that we do not like support.
Yeah.
And we're able to appreciate the humiliation of a woman that he like. So his very performance of Mr. McMahon as heel also makes possible the spectacle of a woman taking her clothes off that everybody's like going crazy about and cheering for.
Yep.
So it's this kind of have both ways thing. And then she also talks about like the plausible deniability that we have as an audience consuming these stories because we're able to say, well, this is just happening in the ring. It's just a story.
Right.
It's not real.
And so that book, the whole argument of that book is that these are all stories of masculinity, and that's what's being worked out in the ring. Also, the book came out in 94 or 95. So the book came out before the Attitude Era shift.
Okay.
So it's really interesting how it fits in to that. But because she spends a lot of time on the Hulk Hogan Randy Savage feud over Miss Elizabeth, which is again two dudes fighting over a woman and all this. Yeah. I was watching Sting and Ric Flair. Well, let's not talk about Ric Flair.
Okay, let's not. There are too many things. So like that's one of the things. It's just like scripts and performances of masculinity, what we expect them to have, what we disallow inside of them, and what the consequences of that
and
are.
I think like, so I guess one of the things we're talking about, like, why do I think wrestling is interesting? So there's also the kind of inverse potential of wrestling in that it can be a space where you can play out storyline as opposed. So WWF is always very reflective. It's just reflecting what they think can draw money.
Sure.
And it's never going to try to get ahead of where the culture is. It's always going to be it is very much a lowest common denominator, right? However, I do think there are plenty of examples in professional wrestling and other places where the world of professional wrestling can actually get ahead, because it's separate space. It can get ahead of where society is, as opposed to being right. And you saw the one places I would look is like the way. So I mentioned in the South, in the NWA and the different Southern territories, especially like Mid-South, which was in sort of Texas and East Texas. You had a lot of racial storylines that were far ahead, where the black guy is the babyface.
Sure.
I mean, the Junkyard Dog Freebird storyline I was talking about that culminated in a massive match in New Orleans and drew huge was built around this black babyface and these rednecks with Confederate flags that were the bad guys, right? Sure. Dusty Rhodes did a lot of the same stuff in the South. So there's other places you can look.
But do you feel like I hear you. I wonder if that's a good example, because like, do we feel like that's getting ahead of where we are because, racism still exists?
Right.
Or do we feel like that is a staging of a kind of black-white race binary that continues to play out only with narratives of racist oppression, such that there's no complicated story that you can tell.
This was 1974, though.
Oh, 74.
Right? Yeah, this is in the
Okay.
So this is when what was interesting is I've been reading Terry Funk's biography, an old wrestler from Texas in this era from the 70s. He wrestled from all the way up to the 90s, but in the 70s, 80s, and he talks about wrestling in Texas and parts of the South where he's like, there were people cheering for a black guy who would never, this is the only time they would ever cheer for a black guy.
Because it's a character and not a human.
Right. Yes. Right? But but that's very different than the kind of race baiting that WWF did, where all the black wrestlers had to do headbutts and looked like they were from Central Africa. Right. And so there's a way that
the fucking Iron Sheik, man.
Yeah. The Iron Sheik.
That
although you know what's happened now that they're getting millions of dollars from Saudi Arabia every year, those anti-Muslim caricatures have vanished.
Well, so I'm glad that, my other the other I took a lot of mental notes. I typically write so many, but on this it's
all right.
There were
wrestling's improvisational. Call it in the ring, as they say.
Well, the other thing, though, that I at the last minute, put down as, I don't know, we should talk about is this, what you were just saying about how it is reflective of the cultural moment. And so I do think that there, and this came up, in the first 2-3 episodes about how wrestling is this really particularly American phenomenon in it isn't as a force, but as it takes shape in America.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
It is full of these storylines that mirror and rely on a really particular mode of nationalistic jingoism. And, the babyface heel dynamic is that's part of what Hulk Hogan's early appeal was. Oh, yeah. He was Captain America.
Yeah. The match against the first championship match where he beats Iron Sheik, it says Made in America on his t-shirt.
Yes. So, that made me think about what, Noam Chomsky says about the way that media works and the way that specifically sports media works.
Yeah.
About how it creates this diversion and sort of escapist fantasy by which we can focus on something and care about it and really invest, thus taking our eye completely off the proverbial ball by putting it on the literal ball. I don't know. But we stop thinking about then the actual systems that structure our lives.
Yeah.
That, affect us economically
yeah.
and civically. And it feels better to focus on the things that are not important to our daily lives, because then we don't have to think about the realities of our daily life. And that nationalism and patriotism and the submission to a very specific kind of authority and leadership really is part of that. It's a really important part of that.
I think WWF/WWE was particularly invested in kind of nationalism because it was the first sort of national brand. They were the first one to try to go across the country. So, they used to have red, white, and blue ropes. The Hogan was built as an American hero. Yes. All of this sort of stuff, right? So yes, although it does ebb and flow because that stopped working in the early 90s. And
this is when the Attitude Era came, right?
The Attitude Era really starts in 96. But and Stone Cold, who becomes the biggest draw. I mean, the biggest draw in 97, 98. He's the biggest draw in wrestling in 98, 99. In terms of, when I say draw, rating, you could look at the quarter hours of the ratings. He's spiking them in terms of merchandise sales, in terms of ticket sales when he's in the main event. So, and Austin's whole bit was for people. This was the like president I want to have a beer with era. Like he was the guy who was just a normal dude.
Yeah.
He's like Steve Austin. If you look at him, he's not that big. Like I don't think Steve Austin took steroids. Like he didn't need to. Like his whole character was being incredibly relatable. He got there with a camouflage hat and a jean jacket and a skull on the back of his shirt. Mm-hmm. So, and even the Undertaker, who's like this mystical, like wizard figure by the Attitude Era, becomes a biker. Mm-hmm. Like, so there's this realism moment that I think it is about people's everyday lives in a certain way. It's like, I hate my fucking boss. Like, who wouldn't? Like, the whole appeal of that storyline was like, I hate my boss. Right. Of course, like, and if you think about where society was in the kind of late 90s, it fits in a certain way, right? Sure. And so, which is, so I think, but that was, it is still a kind of almost ideological, in some ways, I think, like, Kayfabe, this sort of fictional world of wrestling, is just another form of ideology. It's just there to mask these. Right? Sure. So it is sort of masking your discontent by in a sort of proxy. Sure. Seeing Stone Cold, give Vince McMahon a stunner and bust his head open or whatever. So that's definitely, I think, there. Mm-hmm. I don't think what's interesting is where but the nationalism thing, I think, is very much a WWF thing. Like Vince always had them sing America the Beautiful before WrestleMania, had somebody come sing it because he thought that it was a better song than it should have been the real national anthem.
Oh my God. I just
like and what's even funnier is like in Japan, wrestling got to Japan because people like seeing Japanese guys beat up these Americans that would come over after World War II. Like it was a nationalist thing in Japan. Yeah. It's a little different in Mexico. It also started as a nationalist project to show that Mexico was a modern nation.
And I mean, sports follows this kind of function in lots of different domains.
That's the argument.
The Olympics.
That's the greatest argument for pro wrestling as a sport, is that it has functioned historically in the same way that it comes along the same track.
But I have lots of critique of the Olympics too.
Sure. Yeah.
So I don't know. Those are my things. Scripts about masculinity, scripts about nationalism. What you got?
Well, for me, like the one thing that jumped out the second time through is this idea of kayfabe that comes up at one point, and they talk about it, the fictional world, or the idea that this is all real, or we're not going to tell the audience it's fake or real. It was interesting as I was kind of charting how people talked about these things. McMahon really, really, really wants to make it clear that this is all fantasy. So not me, my character, right? Like,
sure.
And I didn't even mean to. That's and I noticed, and I think that is actually sort of central to how he thought about professional wrestling in general, and like what it should look like. So Paul Levesque, who's now doing the creative for WWE, is always talking about the blurring of lines. Like there's a moment they talk about the famous curtain call, which is as two wrestlers, Diesel and Razor Ramon, were leaving WWF to go to WCW at they have a show that wasn't on TV. It was what they call a house show at Madison Square Garden. And
right.
At the end of the match, all four of them go to the Razor Ramon, Diesel, and Shawn Michaels and Triple H, who are all friends, stand in the ring together and kind of hug. And it was this sort of curtain call, but like half of them were good guys, half of them were bad guys.
Right.
And people were sort of, video of this ended up on the internet. And I remember reading about this it was a big deal to a lot of old school wrestlers, and a big deal, like, Bruce Pritchard, who's like Vince McMahon's toady on there. It was like, it was a big deal. And
this is the day that wrestling died, as we knew it.
Yes, that's what he said, the day that wrestling died. And
because the curtain was lifted.
Right.
Or like the veil was.
Triple H loved that moment.
Yeah,
he's here for that moment.
Yeah.
And
a lot of younger generation folks were.
Yes. And like Cody Rhodes, who's in the documentary, who's the current WWE champion, whose dad was one of
Dusty Rhodes,
one of the greatest wrestlers ever. One thing I did learn from this, I did not know that Vince tried to hire Dusty away and Dusty turned him down. I did not know that, which would make, because Dusty did go to the WWF later and got horribly embarrassed. Anyways, so there was something there, because it struck me. I did watch the first Netflix episode of Raw when they got their new Netflix deal, and there was this long intro video voiced over by Paul Levesque, by Triple H, where he talks. It shows him at a typewriter, and it talks about the stories we tell and good guys, and it's just very much this thing of like, welcome to my fictional world, and and I was just like,
gentle reader.
That was the day wrestling died for me. Like I was like, I was like, oh, you're not even playing anymore. Like you're not even, you're opening this new thing with this imagined new audience of Netflix viewers with this whole sort. So tracking that to me was interesting to think about, like what that then, like for McMahon, it was always about escapism and complete fantasy. And I think that that's where, if you want to do the kind of psychoanalysis of McMahon of the real McMahon and through the character, you can start to see why he would want that. Sure. In that way. So yeah,
but it's about blurred lines for Paul.
Yeah,
I don't disagree. As we learned though in the not too distant past from Robin Thicke, blurred lines can also be their own messed up defense, and those lines tend to be drawn by dudes in control.
Yeah.
And I mean, like, so yeah, I mean, coming back to the question of like, psychoanalytic, do we need to know who this, I don't know that I find that a super interesting thought experiment. I also, but I do think it's part of how this kind of functions as a cult documentary for me, because like while the narrative arc of this series is really different, we don't have the typical like, here's the initial appeal, here's how people got roped in, but here was where it took a turn, and now here's where people's lives are now. The characters and the implications, I think, are pretty similar, because we do that. I think that the focus on that whole like, what kind of psychoanalysis do we want to do for Vince McMahon? For me, it's like dudes with dad issues, but like we still that is I think always present in the characterization of a charismatic leader with singular appeal. Yeah. So we really want to know who this person is, even as we're working to demystify and deconstruct that person's power. And, he's demanding a lot of his employees, his followers. He's making them work 7 days a week.
The number of people who said he was a father figure.
Oh my God.
I mean, John Cena, like,
but then answering to no one. So like he is this father figure who is like filling this role for so many people, his employees, but also like the fans of pro wrestling, because people are drawn into it, looking for something basic and chill, in good show, entertainment, neat characters and storylines, fights. Yeah. Like those are basic things in the way that we talk about how in these cult documentaries, like folks are looking for belonging or community or love and connection or whatever, but it ends up being about a lot more than that. So the very fact that Linda McMahon, who we see as this CEO, but also very present character.
Yeah. She's in the video games. You can play it. You can wrestle with her.
Secretary of Education, everybody.
Yeah.
Like like there's nothing, I mean, for me, there's nothing more to say. Like the fact that that person with that resume can then be put in front of Congress with a straight face and be like, confirmed in good faith is to me a reflection of the implications that these kinds of moments of pop media have.
And she ran for Senate twice.
Sure, and lost.
And what's interesting though is like, so Dave Meltzer, who's in the documentary a lot, and is I don't know what you thought of him.
He's the report. He's like a reporter, right?
He is the founder and writer of the Wrestling Observer newsletter, which is like the go-to behind the scenes.
So he's not like an investigative reporter in the way that what's his name was, but he was he's kind of like fan reporter.
But he in the documentary, he's very much the arbiter of like what really happened because he knows everybody, and I do think people have mixed feelings about him. He was the one
who said that like after the steroids trial and McMahon is found not guilty of like, procuring and pushing steroids for his performers, that like he shouldn't have been convicted, but that doesn't mean he was a good guy.
Right. No,
like,
and Meltzer's the one. He was the one who was like at 78,000, not 90,000. There's mixed feelings about Dave Meltzer amongst wrestling fans.
Okay.
I think he's fine. And I tend to agree with a lot of his opinions about things. But I think so two things. One, on that point. So they were gonna that whole Pennsylvania doctor that was the focus of this thing,
of the steroids.
Yeah,
scandal.
the reason they got off is that doctor never worked for WWE. He was assigned by the Pennsylvania Athletic Commission.
Yeah.
They were going to hire him to work for WWF.
Yeah.
But Linda McMahon was tipped off at a party that there was heat on him by the cops. It's insane. Anyways,
I have no space.
It's
we don't have to reckon with that though here in the same way that we do in the cult documentaries.
Well, what I was gonna say was, Meltzer
go.
has a great point. I think he makes the documentary, but I've heard him make it in other cases all the time. Is like, so like, McMahon runs for Senate twice, but none of the stuff about, like, everyone knew about affairs that McMahon had been having since the 80s, right?
Yeah.
And none of that comes out. You would expect that a Republican running for Senate, someone would unearth that as at least the kind of like family values gotcha. It never comes out because so much of this gets dismissed as, oh, that's just the fake wrestling. So sports reporters don't touch it and entertainment reporters don't touch it. And so, like, in the same way that we are also, there's often dismissive as like, that's just a weird cult. Like the way that like those more marginal things don't really matter.
Yes.
So we don't have to look at them or talk about them until something, until Waco happens or whatever, right?
Right.
Like, that's the same thing here. Like the Ring Boy scandal, if that happened, like, that just got completely ignored.
No, totally. And the thing is, it's like, if, with the cult documentaries, again, as I have long opined, like, I think that those function to make us, among other things, like, they play lots of roles, but I think that they function to make us feel better about our own, like, super normal, totally chill practices that are not weird at all. And that those people over there are the ones who are being manipulated, not me. I would never. And even though, like, here there are these there's the alleged abuse and trafficking and drug abuse and lying and manipulation and whatever, but we don't want to shut it down.
Right.
So it's fine.
Yeah.
Like, I think that we make a big deal about those kinds of things in a cult leader, so-called.
Right.
When we want to create distance and separation. And so then we amplify these things that make the person look a monster. Here, we bring them up, but ultimately it really, and it lands, to me, this series as like a fun character sketch of this complicated dude billionaire.
Yeah.
And like, yawn, because I don't, and it's why. But that's the distinction, I think, for me between it's how I think it functions as, and why I think it's relevant for our conversations about cults. But also it's where a distinction is, because this is not a structure that we want to poke at or do anything about. And in the process, I mean, family values is our own socio-political kayfabe. Because it gets performed and played out in certain ways such that we're in on the joke.
Right.
We know that like
when someone running for president goes to the Iowa State Fair
and brags about sexual abuse,
just that we all assume
kayfabe.
They act like I'm so happy to be in Iowa, and it's like, no, you're not, and we know you're not.
Sure,
but we decide not to. Like, we pretend.
But we need you to perform like you are, whatever. But then when we have, and I guess that this is what for me becomes such a like, I don't know, like where something else then starts being at work is like when you break through that wall, when you have the wrestlers giving a hug, and some people think like this is the end of it, and other people think like finally we're being honest. I think that there's a similar disconnect or something about when Vince McMahon or Donald Trump are like bragging about sex abuse.
Yeah.
And they're not performing the scripts we expect.
Right.
But somehow it manages to even further reinforce the part of them that is the anti-establishment, I'm an outsider. And so then in that moment, that's what we care about instead of someone performing the traditional family value script. So when we decide what parts of what narrative we do or don't care about is what's interesting to me.
Yeah, yeah. And I think this is why one of the first things that got me thinking about kayfabe outside of wrestling was the perplexity with which in 2016 and 2017, all of these writers about religion in America were like, how could 82% or 83% of evangelicals support this?
Sure.
And I'm like, because it's kayfabe. Like, it's like it was just part of the kayfabe.
And we're doing it all the time.
Yeah.
Like, there's nothing that is not affected by those same kinds of dynamics.
Right.
But, you know, so I think that wrestling, if I'm going to be like my generous read, and why I think that I just circle back to like why I was willing to watch this, and then, you know, I think that it was useful for a conversation, is that I think it shines a light on those dynamics that in so many other respects we don't see operative, and we don't really pay attention to it. It highlights those. It's just that in the process of highlighting those, it also obscures a bunch of other things that then because we're not putting a religion, like the things that religion and cult, like those labels shine a light on, are things that get obscured in this context.
Yeah.
So that, anyway.
No, that makes sense. I mean, Eero Lane, who's a scholar of theater and performance studies, he has a thing on kayfabe. He says that kayfabe is the truth that they want you to believe, which I think is just like a great way to think about it outside of wrestling. So, like, what's your takeaway? My takeaway is
you go first.
Emotion.
There you go.
I think I just buzzed out this microphone. Emotion. Oh no, it's the McMahon talks about this. Like when the crowd reacts, and you've got them right there, like that. And Linda McMahon says it. Like Triple H says it. I think Undertaker says it. Like, but to me, like, I don't think like that is like it at bottom the business strategy of professional wrestling has set aside WWF, which, you know, some people, I mean, it's barely professional wrestling, but has always been you draw emotion, and if you can draw emotion from the crowd, you can draw money.
Sure.
Right? And to me, like, I think it's about putting butts in seats, which is what so many other things in our society are about, but they're not as obvious about it, or as, you know. And so I think, you know, there's such obvious connections to, you know, like so many forms of megachurch Christianity in the United States. But that idea of it is about getting an emotional response from the audience, and if you can do that, then you really got, and that's what I like. Like, for me, it's not in the kind of like dumb storylines and dumb skits that McMahon did on WWF television. For me, it's the moment. Like, I was watching a couple nights ago. There's a great show as an AEW show.
What is AEW?
AEW is All Elite Wrestling. They're the other national. They're the other national company now competing with WWE.
Sure.
Or I was watching a Japanese show too. But like, there are these moments in these matches that are so athletic where you see the sequence of moves happening, and then somebody does something. My alarm was going off. We have to wrap this up. I have class soon. But somebody does something. There's a move that you just don't see coming, and it's so athletic and so impressive that you're just like, I jump out of the seat.
Yeah.
Like, that's it for me, which is it's an emotional reaction, but it's not about like, yay, Steve, whatever, bark like a dog, whatever.
Sure.
So I think there's something, to me, that's something that I think is about wrestling that translates to lots of other things.
Yeah.
And it's a different way into the kind of affect theory than other ways that people, and especially in religious studies, come at it, that I'm interested in, I guess.
My takeaway is short. I find Richmond exhausting, but I think Bob Costas is a treat.
Bob Costas.
I was glad that he made an appearance.
Yeah.
And I don't know. I delight in his insights. Yeah. I think he's always making good points. I feel similarly about Chris Fowler. He's another sports commentator that I like a lot.
Yeah. Okay.
I'm familiar with Chris Fowler because he announces for a lot of the tennis tournaments and slams. Okay. Big Chris Fowler fan. And so
he does college football too. That's what I
Yeah, he does football too, but I don't watch him there. I always feel like there's a little tiny bit of a betrayal. I'm like, what do you mean you also announce for football? How can you care about football? But he's good. Yeah. So anyway,
he's better than Herb Street.
Anyways. That's what I got. I like Bob Costas.
I like it.
Are we allowed to like? I don't know. He's probably super problematic too.
Bob Costas?
No, I don't know.
Bob Costas is great.
I don't know.
Bob Costas is great.
What you got a cult favorite?
Yeah. So okay. Yeah. If in my mind, WWE is, I don't know, name your mainstream pop band of choice. Like that's what they are.
Okay.
And I've always been drawn. I'm looking for like the Pavement of professional wrestling, or like whatever indie band. Like that's I'm like, oh well, have you seen the 1996 match from the Tokyo Dome?
Sure.
So because the world of wrestling is so huge. So on this week that we talked about this, I want to plug my favorite online wrestling writer, poet, person, Colette Arand. She has a poetry book, a book of poems called "Hold Me Close, Gorilla Monsoon," that is about wrestling and does a lot of interesting things with wrestling. That's totally worth people's time. She also has a series of zines. I don't know if they're still available online yet. So she takes famous wrestling promos, like the interview segments or like the talking segments that wrestlers do, from around time and place and turns them into poems. Like literally just takes the words and organizes them into poetry. So if it's and has some of the really great ones, like Dusty Rhodes' famous Hard Times promo. And then she also has a newsletter called Big Egg that her and Joseph Monticello do, where they take different matches every week and they each write an essay about them, and that's free actually. And then they have a you can pay for like an extra like conversation with them. And they have a master list where they've listed their favorite, like the best, like 70 matches or whatever. And they're from Mexico, they're from Japan, they're from different times and places. So it's like these essays are always sort of putting the match into its context of whatever storyline or show or promotion it's in. But then they're really interesting readings of the art form and taking it seriously in a way that I really appreciate. And it's also ways that I've found all sorts of wrestling I would have never watched otherwise, because I don't have time to go plunge through all of the YouTube matches that are possible. So I'll put links to this stuff in the show notes. But go check out Colette's work. She's great.
Cool. I mean, typically, you know how I like a theme, and I always try to like bring in something that connects up. I don't know that this one is quite as direct, but I've been having a couple of weeks, and I am my cult favorite is like people showing up with kind and helpful things to say.
There you go.
So specifically, thank you to our listeners who are giving us documentary ideas. I love hearing it every single time we get a little message that says, hey, have you watched this one? Or how about this one? Or are you going to do this one? It makes me so happy. So thank you to those of you who are doing that. And then also, it was last week a student from like out of the blue from a class that I taught like 15 years ago emailed me to say, hey, I teach media production now. And that was a really helpful class. And I appreciate it.
That's cool.
I think about some of the conversations we had in there. And
that's very cool.
Yeah, man. Like we all want to feel seen and heard. But like, if you haven't told someone thanks lately for something
pay it forward, listeners.
Pay it forward and also move backward in time and tell someone thanks for something.
Yeah. That's very cool.
So, yeah, maybe that's also like, I don't know if I can somehow connect that to what we've been talking about, the recognitions of vulnerability and the ability to perform them in real time in good faith. I find valuable.
Yes. So, and thanks to everyone who's listening to this. And you can support our show by sending us messages. Like, we appreciate those.
We take special requests.
Writing a review or leaving us a rating or subscribing or finding us on the socials at Cult Favorite Pod. Special thanks to the Department of Religious Studies at the University of Alabama.
We're sitting in your office right now.
We're in my office, yeah.
And now you can see it, everybody.
This is it.
Maybe we can go to my office next time. We can maybe switch back and forth.
Sure.
I don't know.
Yeah.
I cordially invite you to my office upstairs.
Definitely. Who knows where we'll do this next?
I'll make you a coffee.
I would love that. I would love that.
Okay.
So, yeah, and we will see everybody in a couple weeks.
Yay.
Yay. Bye.